an activity, but we're going to start off with the idea of communication this morning. It's really the central piece of what I'm going to talk about over the day, and even was talking about last night. It's not, and I want to make sure you understand this with me, it's not to come in here and say, guys, we do a terrible job. This is about across the board. The ladies are going to be talking about very similar, same topics with very similar content. So this isn't like trying to single us out. This is more talking about the importance of it, what it looks like, and what we can do as far as doing a little better, okay? So again, the theme is a better us. It starts with a better self, and that's always, should always, right? As Christians, we say, and I've heard it prayed often, that we'd be a little bit more like Christ today or tomorrow than we were yesterday. Anybody pray that prayer? Or something similar? At least we carry that idea, right? That we want to walk a little bit more in His image each day. And that's really what the emphasis is. If we have that image of what is better, trying to walk in it just a little bit more each day as we kind of grow in the things that matter the most. So let's go ahead and get into some just basic stuff. What is communication? And I don't want to bore us, but just to get some starting point here in front of us, communication is essentially the passing or transmitting of an idea or an emotion or a thought or series of thoughts between one person and someone else. That's all it is. It is as simple as talking and listening, but it's a crucial aspect of healthy relationships. Now, we've been communicating since we arrived in this world. Before we had words, we communicated to our parents, through crying or smiles or whatever it is. And then as we've grown and matured, then we added vocabulary. And then as we grew up and became teenagers, then we added a little more attitude at times. And then as we matured into adults, hopefully we learned what to say, when to say it, when not to say it. And then we felt pretty good about communication. I've got this, I know how to talk, and I know how to listen. But it's a little bit deeper than that when we want meaningful communication. Have you ever noticed that we can pull up to, I don't know if there's a kind of a local place that a lot of people go around here. Those things have kind of disappeared, but used to have where everybody would show up for breakfast or for lunch, and you just talk for 30 minutes about basically nothing. You're right, the weather. So-and-so's cows down the road, not that that's not important, but things that aren't very deep. But when we start to talk about things that are really important, we seem to struggle a little bit more. And that's across the board, but it seems to be a reality that most of us probably can share in. So again, I'm putting up these big blocks. I don't normally do that with text. The reason why I made it this way wasn't so that you'd read all this off there. I'm going to talk about it. But if you want a copy of the slides, you can go back and you can read these things and not just have a bullet point and say, well, what do he mean by that? Communication is only valuable if it truly conveys or results in understanding. There's a difference between talking and someone hearing the words pass through their ears and understanding, right? Everybody in here... I'm not sure. I don't know everybody's. Have kids? Been around kids? Yeah, everybody's had kids or has kids now. They understand everything you tell them, right? Yes, right? I mean, as soon as it comes out of your mouth, they're like, yes, Dad, I understand what you mean. I'm going to be right on that, and I'm going to do it. No. What's usually especially as they're younger, but teenagers too, and as they get older even sometimes, what's usually the conversation about them telling them something? What do you normally have to do? Repeat it. You have to repeat it. Well, they heard the words pass through their ears, and then maybe somewhere along the line there's a phrase that comes up and we say, are you listening to me? Or some form of that, right? Because we don't always listen to understand, do we? And we can see that very well with our kids. Sometimes we listen to just respond or react. And we're talking in Scripture, you see the Pharisees do this a lot, right? When Jesus is preaching, They're not listening to understand. They're listening for what?
To figure out how they can argue with you.
Yeah, they're listening to something for something they can react to, they can get mad about, they can go after him for. They're not listening to understand. They're not listening to understand where he's coming from, what he means. They're listening just to react. So many problems arise in relationships, whether it's friendships, but of course, most importantly, as we're talking about today, is about marriage. But in relationships, the goal of understanding is neglected in exchange for something else. Anything else is less than ideal, and we'll talk about the don'ts here in a minute, of just wanting to be heard. Instead of wanting to be understood. And we've kind of, maybe that's why we get upset and we raise our voice and someone yells. They just want to be heard because they feel like they're not being listened to. But there's not really understanding that's going on there. Then people are responding, or reacting rather, to the anger or to the emotion rather than to the words. So, and I'll say this, I'm pretty good at having a calm demeanor. That doesn't mean that I always have a calm demeanor. With my kids, I'm fairly good, but there have been times that they've made me really angry. And, I started yelling. But do you think when I was yelling that they were listening to and saying, boy, I really understand my father right now? What was going through their heads? Yeah, Dad's mad. And I need to respond to the mad, not necessarily what he's mad about. Do you follow me? A little bit. Okay? So it happens naturally. This isn't something that we went out of the way and created these problems for ourselves. But the more we can recognize the things that we're going to talk about, the better we can improve our communication. And I don't know, last night as I had that list up there and we were talking about the things that kind of lead to dissatisfaction in marriage and eventually divorce, when we talk about what the opposites of those things are, they're all tied to being able to communicate well. And that's not, sitting down for an hour and listening to every detail of everything. That's not necessarily what that means. But it does mean that there's understanding passing back and forth, not just words. All right. So 4 ways to not communicate. We're going to start with the negative and then work towards the positive. And these are really, really important to understand. This can be applied universally. If you are a business owner and you're working with employees, it may be really easy to say, well, that's my employee, I'm the boss, I can talk to him however I want to. But long-lasting, good employees and good relationships where you can depend on them and build those things, good communication skills are important there. It doesn't have to just be in a marriage, but they're heightened in a marriage because, well, that's supposed to be our other half. That is supposed to be, the person we're doing life with. And raising kids and all that. But these are the 4 we're going to talk about briefly. Placating, blaming, computing, that one may sound interesting, and of course distracting, which will be a little bit more generic. But let's start with this one. Placate, and I've got a made up word here. I'm just going to tell you there. The placator, that's not actually a word. But simply avoids by trying to placate their partner, bring an end to whatever uncomfortable situation may be occurring. There's another term that I've often heard used for this. Does it come to anybody else's mind rather than placating someone? Have you ever heard the expression taking a dive? Is that one that's come across? You're in a discussion, an argument, and husband takes a dive. Do you know what I'm talking about? What is that? You agree even if you don't really agree, just so what? You can get out of the argument. Do y'all recognize that? I'm not asking you to tell on yourself or anything here, but there's the idea, and women can do this too. It's like I started. This is not just about I'm going to gear it towards us a little bit more, but we're talking about the same things in both classes. So to placate, just trying to get out of that uncomfortable situation and do whatever it takes. That's not good. That's not communicating. That's avoidance. And you'll see that that's true of all these. All right, number 2, blaming. The blamer shifts the blame to the other spouse and does not take personal responsibility. This one's pretty obvious. It happens more than we realize. My grandparents, I mean, I adore my grandparents. My grandmother has now passed away. My grandfather is still living. When I grew up, when I was about 4 years old, my parents divorced. They did not get along well. I grew up in a broken home, and they feuded back and forth. I did not grow up in a Christian home. My family didn't go to church anywhere. My grandparents were my rock. Okay, so every Friday night we went to Nana and Pop's house. All the holidays were at their house. When my dad had to be out of town for work, you know, we stayed with them. They were my rock. And I have so many wonderful memories of that and stability from that. Well, my grandfather used to make this joke, and I found it funny growing up. And he meant it as humor. He didn't mean it in anything other than that, I don't think. But there was just kind of a reality sitting underneath that humor. So he would say, my grandma would say that he always blamed her for everything. And he said, well, there are only 2 people here, and I know I didn't do it. So that just leaves you. It was kind of in jest, and I remember that fondly just from the humor part of it. But sometimes there's a lot of reality there. If I don't want to take responsibility, then naturally I tend to pass it to someone else. And that's where we get into the blame game. So we're going to talk about this more in conflict resolution, but if I came in to a conversation with you, not in a marriage obviously, but just a conversation with, and I came up to you and I said, you make me mad, what's your first instinct? What I do? Okay? You're defensive, wanting to respond. But why are you wanting to respond and feel defensive? One word. Well, 2, but you. As soon as I start with you, what'd I do? I didn't come in and say, I feel mad about something. I said, you. And as soon as you heard that, it's like, boom, you make me. I just blamed you for what? How I'm feeling right now. I know that sounds cheesy, and it's really simple, and we'll get more complicated here in a minute. But as soon as it does, you get automatically defensive. Blame does not help communicate, especially when it's avoiding personal responsibility. But blame in any point, even if there is something to be blamed, is not the best way to communicate. So the blamer shifts the blame to the other spouse, does not take personal responsibility. We brought up some things. Well, what could be at the heart of some difficulties that couples have? Finances. Right? Has finances ever been an issue in your home? Been an issue in my home. Usually it's because there's not enough of it, right? In other words, there's not enough money in the bank. That's usually what happens. And then if we're not careful, it's like, oh, there's not enough. We're going through kind of a lean part of our life. When we first started, got married, we got married young. We both were working with not a career, but jobs. There wasn't a whole lot of money to go around. Our parents didn't have much means either side, so there wasn't really anybody to lean on as far as that. We had some real trying years financially. But it would have been really easy, and this happens a lot, when you got a car that broke down, you don't have the money, and then you go back and look at the checking account, and you start saying, well, we don't have the money because you bought this, this, and this. So you see where blaming can really quickly get into a conversation and not be very productive. We're just identifying these for the moment. Computing. This one may sound a little different, the computer is one that uses overanalyzation to avoid emotions and deflect feelings of others. All of these are avoidance. In other words, they're avoiding communicating, understanding, but you overanalyze things so you don't have to deal with maybe the emotions of someone else, spouse possibly. So the computer will take and analyze details that have nothing really to do with the point, right? So you get in a conversation, and maybe it is with your wife, and you're saying, listen, I'm really frustrated right now about this, and that, and she starts to pull out little details and just focus, well, what about this and this and this, rather than dealing with the point that you're frustrated. Or you might do the same. Again, it's a form of avoidance where I don't want to deal with this, so I'll find something that I'm more comfortable to deal with. And again, communication does not occur. All right. And then the last one is distracting. Anything, this is kind of a generic one, anything that distracts us from being able to talk and communicate and understand is going to fall into this. Distraction can be a more general term, but these forms, all these forms that we're talking about, as well as any other form not mentioned that seeks to avoid the conflict or even the act of communication. Now, I don't know how you would describe your marriage. I don't have that. I'm not that information, and I don't know that, and I don't need to know that. But what I'm going to say throughout the lessons here is that reminder that if I step on your toes, it's not purposefully. I'm just trying to share things that are important for us to understand. So it's easy to push off the speaker. And I just want to put this in front of us. You can say, well, you've only been married 23 years. You don't know how it is to be married 40 or 50 years. Well, you've been married 23 years, and you're a little bit older now, and you don't know what it's like to be a newlywed with young kids anymore. Or you've got kids that are in college and high school, but it's been a while since you had little kids. You don't really remember how hard it is. Or you don't have grown kids and their problems and so forth, and you don't know how difficult it is to deal with them. And you're right, but that's not the point. I am not the point. The point is the material that we're talking about is going to be biblically based and proven, so that if we want to walk into it a little bit more, that we can enter in a space that, again, we're walking just a little bit better, okay? But the biggest thing I want to do for us today is put some things out there for us to know, and hopefully to build a little bit of understanding, which hopefully if I communicate well today, maybe we'll do that. All right, so those are 4 things, and we could add to that list. Those are 4 things as examples of what not to do. All of them are about avoidance. Now, I know this has never occurred, that your wife is upset, so you take an extra stop somewhere on the way home. When you get home, you don't go straight into the house. You go to the shed or to the barn or to the shop and work on something so that you can avoid. I know that's never happened to any of us in here. And I know that if they're sitting over there and asking and saying the same thing, that there's some problems or there's an argument or whatever, that they didn't take an extra minute at Walmart or stop at Food Line even though they didn't really need to, or Kroger or wherever, just to avoid a little bit longer. What happens when we avoid things?
You get mulling them over and stewing on them and doing your own arguments in the end.
Yeah, and that makes them better, right?
Oh, yeah.
It makes them a lot better.
I win a lot of arguments.
Yeah, I can win a lot of arguments in my head too, but somehow I still lose a lot of those. I don't know. There's a couple things that happen when we avoid things. Let's just take it out of this conversation as far as communication in marriage and just put it on the side here. Anybody? Well, I don't know if anybody. I'll use my wife. She won't mind. She doesn't. She does not like roller coasters. Okay, so obviously we got kids. A lot of trips that we have done over the years have involved, not a lot, but a few of them, theme parks. We went to Disney twice. The first time we went to Disney, Faith was 4. Maybe she was 5. She was right in that age. We wanted to go where they were all old enough to remember it if we're going to spend that kind of money. So we go down to Disney, and Tiffany was very anxious about getting on the roller coaster. She gets on, if you know anything about Disney World, they have some older ones like Space Mountain and Big Thunder Mountain, and they have some newer ones, and especially in the other theme parks like Animal Kingdom and so forth. So we go, and she gets on Space Mountain. She's nervous, whatever, but she does it. She's good. She's more nervous as we get on to Big Thunder Mountain, which these are, as far as roller coasters goes, these aren't big roller coasters. They're like 35 miles an hour. The next day we go to Animal Kingdom, and there they have this roller coaster. It does about 55, goes backwards, has a real big steep drop off, and you can see it from outside. You can see kind of how high it is. Again, as far as roller coasters, it's fairly mild, but terrified her. So she walks, we walk in the line. It's Everest, Mission Everest. So we walk through the line. You know, you got to spend an hour to ride 2 minutes, right? So we get all the way through the line, and she gets up there, and she makes a joke of it because she's not going to get on, and she's going to go out the side there and leave, and they open the gate for her to go. So she does the chicken walk as she walks out. Funny. She wanted to get on another roller coaster. Every time she started to get to the roller coaster, she'd just get anxious, and that anxiety would build. We go a couple years later to a little Legoland. It's just a little park in right outside Tampa and Winter Haven down in Florida. And the roller coasters are just not, you know, they're definitely not Kings Island and things like that. They're fun little roller coasters, but terrified when you get on them. They were less impactful, if you would, than the one she had already rode. Some friends said we go to Kentucky Kingdom, wouldn't get on any of those, getting petrified. We go back to Disney World. She wouldn't get on the roller coasters that she had already rode. The more she avoided it, the more the anxiety about it grew. And that's just the way anxiety works. Your body physically wants to remove itself from whatever that is. So when it knows that it will, physically, mentally, emotionally, you have told yourself basically, physiologically, that you will avoid it, it's going to ramp it up so you'll avoid it quicker. What happens when we start getting into a spot where we don't want to communicate and talk, and we start to get anxious about it, stressed about it, whatever word makes us feel more comfortable, we start to avoid it. We start to avoid it sooner, and that need or desire to avoid it grows more powerful. It doesn't matter about a roller coaster. It really doesn't. She can never ride another roller coaster again in her life. It should be perfectly fine. Matter of fact, the last time, because of that and her knowing that, she forced herself to get on Aerosmith, which is the fastest roller coaster Walt Disney has, which is hilarious to me. But anyway, those things are insignificant. But when we're talking about things that are bedrock into our life, they're more significant, aren't they? So avoidance builds stress and anxiety. Avoidance also does something else. It eliminates the opportunities that we would have taken, not just for that conversation, but to connect. And over time, that creates distance. So if you remember on the list again, one of those things was intimacy and distance in the relationship. Well, how could there not be distance if I'm constantly running away, basically, and avoiding everything I'm feeling comfortable about? And each time I do it, that desire, that inner kind of stress to do it just grows and grows and grows. Or if Tiffany is in that spot, and every time she's avoiding and avoiding and avoiding. The other thing about avoidance is what Craig started to talk about, kind of ruminating over the issue. You ever been angry about something that you couldn't deal with in the moment? And you start thinking about it? And then you have some time to think about it? How many times do you end up less angry? how many times do you end up more angry? There's all sorts of examples we can pull and use and talk about, but this is about a little bit about our own health. Remember, I start with the idea that those who are in happy marriages have better health, live longer lives. I can't prove this. My personal feeling on that is that stress level, that anxiety level is not the same as those who live in houses where they don't communicate, they're unhealthy, they're unhappy. Anyway, so let's talk about what I was going to summarize here, I guess. To summarize what should be considered unhealthy communication, which the things we were just talking about, anything that does not seek understanding. Anything that voids, blames, distracts, rather than seeking understanding. Gottman, I mentioned him last night. He is a big-time psychologist in the field. I don't know what his belief structure, religious background is. I don't know if he's a religious man. I know in his main he uses quite a bit of language. So I'm not saying that he's the moral compass here. But he has really good studies, and he has done a lot of research. And I found this interesting. He gives a warning that it's important for Christians to consider. The fundamental cause of almost all communication problems that people do not listen to understand. They listen to reply. Now, we can point it out in Scripture. We can pull out the Pharisees, how they came, they would ask a question. Luke chapter 10, the latter part of the chapter, you have that famous story where the lawyer, which he would have been most likely a Pharisee, he was sent by the Pharisees. He came and asked Jesus a question. He said, teacher, which I think he did a little bit tongue-in-cheek, rabbi, your version may say, he says, what's the greatest commandment? Now, when he asked the question, do you suppose, if you're familiar with the story, what's going to be the result is the Good Samaritan, do you suppose he was really interested in what Jesus had to say? It doesn't feel the context, right? And all the other conversations he had at that point, he was waiting for him to make a mistake so that he could react to it or reply to it. This is really interesting. In the story, Jesus says, okay, what does the Scripture say? What is your reading of it? That word reading is the same idea, the word understanding. So if we were to take that Greek word out, the King James, and we just look at the word, it means, what is your understanding? It leads into the conversation of the Good Samaritan, which he tries to deflect at the end, right, by saying, well, who's my neighbor? Right? Again, not trying to understand, but trying to deflect. So we can see these elements of communication other places other than marriage. It's really important, though, to understand that Jesus went for understanding. And that's critical. We want to communicate to understand, not just to reply. I'm not just waiting for you to stop talking so that I can say what I want to say. I'm not listening to find fault. I'm listening to try to understand what you're saying and why you're saying it. That takes a little bit more effort. It takes a little bit more time sometimes. But that's where good communication comes from. Let's talk about our ultimate example a little bit, Jesus himself. And we used one illustration already. But, Jesus, when he spoke, some people listened. How many people understood? Matthew 13. In the book of Matthew, anyways, it kind of starts his dialogue with the parables, right? You have that very first parable, the parable of the sower. And you have that conversation where Jesus is engaging the crowd with what seems to be a simple story. A sower goes out to sow. And he sows the seed indiscriminately. It lands everywhere. Now, first, if you're a farmer sowing seed, is that smart? No, you'd want to sow the seed where? in fertile ground. You purposely seek out the fertile ground, but this sower goes out to sow seed, and it sows everywhere. It just goes everywhere. And the whole point is that God's sending the message out everywhere as you go into the interpretation. And he says some falls on 4 different soil types. And you have the pathway where it's trampled down and so forth, and it doesn't even get a chance. The birds come in and pick it out. You have it falls on the rocky soil, so very little depth of soil, and it springs up, and then the heat of the day, it dies just as quick. Then you have the third, which it gets root and it starts to grow, and then what happened to it? The thorns and the thistles and the cares of the world crept in and kind of choked it out. And then you had the fourth, the good soil in which it bared fruit. Now, in that conversation, the seed was, what did Jesus say the seed was in the interpretation? Remember? Yeah, the Word of God, the gospel, the Word of God, however we want to use the descriptive there. What was the point? All those people in the crowd had ears. They were hearing words go into them. And he said the result is going to be 1 of 4. As quickly as they hear it, it's just going to... They're going to kind of get excited about it for a moment, and then it's going to fade. They'll start down the path, and then it's going to get choked out, or it's really going to bear fruit. What's the difference? What makes the soil type what it is? We say the heart, right? I mean, I'm sure you've preached that sermon before. We talk about the soil type, and we want to have the heart and the mind that's more receptive and so forth. It's the people who sought to understand. So you get in a conversation with Peter and the rest of the disciples as they are to Jesus. And he says, this is really intriguing to me. Some of them, John 6, I get why they're like, we don't get it. We don't understand what you're talking about. There's a lot of problems there in the Jewish mind with eating flesh and drinking blood. That's that conversation. He's the manna that comes from heaven. That's not what he's talking about. But I get that's a little bit more complicated. That picture in the parable seems so simple. Maybe because we get understanding to start with, so we look back and understand it. But they come to him, they say, we don't understand. Can you explain these things to us? And in part of that reply, Jesus says, therefore I speak to them in parables. Because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. I don't know when it was the last time you picked up a new hobby or a new job or something where you had to learn. And I don't know how well you can think back to maybe something that you started completely new, like you've never done it before. But if it's something you want to do, you're eager to listen. When you remember back, you can put yourself in your former shoes and remember that how eager you were. Maybe you played sports when you were growing up. Maybe you can go all the way back there. I can remember Little League. I was so excited about playing baseball. Man, I just gobbled up anything Coach said. I mean, he could have told me to stand on my head, whatever, and I would have tried it. I mean, anything, whatever, anything I could get. I'm just eager to hear so I can try to understand so I can do what it is I want to do. Jesus said they don't have understanding. They don't want it. They don't seek it. So listening, they don't actually hear. Seeing, they don't see. The emphasis here is on the concept of understanding. I double check my time here. We're going to... Okay. Got about 10 minutes. That's good. Continuing, healthy communication then, using both the example of Jesus and what we've been talking about, is achieved when both the husband and wife seek not only to be understood, but also to understand their spouse. I want to be understood. I want to be heard. There's not a single person that wants to be deflected or avoided or their words pushed to the side. But do I want to understand my spouse? Truly understand. That's when good communication, when both are seeking that, are going to happen. It requires a higher level of communication than the passing small talk with coworkers or conversations you have, or talking about sports or weather or whatever it is. Gary Chapman, you've heard that name? Wives mentioned it somewhere along the line. 5 love languages. It's a big thing. It was a really big thing there for a while. He talks about 5 different levels of communication. And I'm going to tell you that this lesson is talking about communication, but everything we talk in this lesson to the next lesson is just going to keep rolling forward as we build our thoughts today. Level 1, though, he calls it hallway talk. Fine, how are you? Just the surface level, how you doing? The conversation you often have when people are coming in and out of church. That same, you just default, right? How are you this morning? Yeah, I'm doing good. Well, you may not be doing good at all, but it's just so default, so surface that you just respond that way. Hallway talk. Level 2 is reporter talk. I just need to know what's happening. Just need to know the facts. I don't really care about anybody necessarily that's involved. Whatever it is, this may be something that happens at work, where so-and-so comes up to you and wants to tell you a big long story about what happens, like what's broke and what needs to be fixed, right? So that you can get back to your job. Level 3 is intellectual talk. Do you know what I think? This is getting past the surface stuff, past just the facts, and starting to get into, do you know me a little bit? Do you know what I think about this? Do I know what you think about this? This is conversations a little bit deeper. Conversations we have sometimes in Bible class. Okay? Trying to understand what people think about this idea, that idea, understand what Scripture says, and so forth. There's nothing wrong with these levels, okay? They're just all part of natural communication. Level 4 is emotional talk, but each one we're getting a little bit deeper. Let me tell you how I feel. This one sometimes is a little bit more uncomfortable for guys. Women spend a lot of time here. Let me tell you how I feel about whatever it is. This is, my son just came back. All 3 of mine went to camp, but my son went to Taylor. He went with Franklin. Levi did. Timothy and Faith went to Big Reedy, went with our group, with Neil, and then the Monroe County group and people from Tennessee and all that. But anyway, so Levi comes back and he says it was a really emotional week at camp. Now, 100-degree weather, tired, and so forth. Camps tend to be emotional. If you've spent some time there, I don't know how many anybody in here go to camp growing up? Yeah, okay. I know you spent some time there as staff too. Okay. So, it can wear on you a little bit. Towards the end of the week, that's usually when you have more baptisms and so forth. I don't always know if that's good or bad. I'm not trying to put it down, but people are just more emotional. So I thought it was going to be something like that. I said, right off the bat, I've never seen adults be more real with us. It made an impact. I talked about a little bit about some of the mistakes they had and how they felt in the moment, and then how they feel these years later, having to carry some of those memories. And that made a huge impact on my son. That's emotional talk. That's a level getting deeper where you can't help but connect. But the final level is loving, genuine truth talk, as he calls it. We're going to use some different phrase to talk about it, but the point is getting down to there's no walls. There's no covering, trying to avoid and trying to push off emotions, whatever. It's just there. And I love that he uses these words: love, genuine, truth. When we turn to Scripture and we listen to Jesus, and we turn to a passage like, I don't know, the book of John. And Jesus has a few things to say about truth, doesn't he? And what's the one that quickly comes to people's mind when it comes to truth? And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Now, it's been quoted for all kinds of stuff, movies and everything else. Context completely avoided, pulled out of context. In the particular context, Jesus is talking about knowing the truth of God, and that will set you free. Free from what? So we'll say sin. That's true, but free from its bonds, not just its presence. In other words, truth and understanding truth will allow you to see differently, function differently, have a different relationship with God. The same is true with other people. Truth builds trust. Genuineness builds openness. And of course, loving covers all of that. But when we learn to communicate at that level, then we're talking about understanding and empathy and things like that, where people feel heard. And they're not yelling to be heard. They're not screaming for someone to listen to them. They're not begging someone to hear like we do with our kids sometimes. Are you listening to me? Just listen for a minute. I don't know how many times I would say that with one of my kids particularly. He'd always want to get ahead of me. He always thought he knew what I was going to say or what needed to be done, and very seldom did he know. But he was so anxious to know. It wasn't because he was trying to be disrespectful. It's like just listen for a moment. Just listen to me. We're not saying that in this level. We're not saying this in the level before it, by the way, either, but we're definitely not saying it here. We're speaking and the person is listening. They're speaking and we're listening. It's genuine. It's true. There's going to be emotions at times. Maybe it's not an emotional thing. It doesn't always have to be an emotional thing. But that's the level of communication we want to get to. I think this is my last slide on this. Yep. So let me recap a little bit, and this is kind of the ground floor. We're going to talk about practical things as we go forward, as we talk about the idea of, in the next one, flexibility and compromise, what that should look like and how we can better understand that and its importance. Then we're going to talk about the big one, conflict resolution. But to talk about those, we need to understand these fundamentals. Being able to talk without avoidance and a desire to be genuine and truthful should be our goals when we communicate. Does that mean every conversation requires that level? No. If, the wife says, hey, the mail just ran, will you go check the mailbox? You don't need to sit down with her and say, I want to be with you in this moment and hear how you feel about me going. That's just silly. But when we come down to important things and taking the time to talk about important things, it's critical that we get down into that level and are comfortable there. And it's critical for our spouses to be there too. Let me just kind of, we technically have about 3-4 minutes left. Do you have any thoughts, any questions that you all want to share? Clear as mud.
The placating thing, which you hear comedians all the time talk about you'll never win an argument with your wife or this or that. You just will learn the word. Yeah, I'm wrong.
Yeah, yes, dear.
That's it.
Oh, yes, dear. I'm not saying that there's not a time for that. Again, if it's something that's in, but if we spend our whole time living that way, we're going to wake up and feel like we don't know the person next to us. And that's what, it's not necessarily, it's a, one day to the next and all of a sudden it changes one way or another. It's the longevity of these things that creates the problems and the issues. There's I can't think of his name now. He's in the Christendom, greater Christendom world, but he's a counselor and so forth. I can't think of his name, Gary something. Anyway, that doesn't really matter. But he writes in a book on the blessing. It's called The Blessing. But he writes about a story, and I can't remember if it's him or a friend. I think it was a friend, happened to be riding a plane. This is back in the 60s during the kind of the height of the space program, and was riding a plane to Houston, and happened to be sitting next to one of the controllers, NASA controllers. And they just started some small talk, and he found this out. So, of course, then he was intrigued. And he was asking him about stuff, and he was telling him some things he couldn't talk about, obviously, but just some things about the program and his job and things like that. And he was really curious about this whole idea of traveling to the moon and stuff. That was the big thing then. And he said, okay, so, how accurate do you guys have to be? He's like, what do you mean? Well, if you're off just a little bit, what's that fraction that you could be off and, everything be? He said, if, a degree or two, so if you're traveling back from the moon to the earth and you're off 1 degree, and I may not have the exact number, but he said, you will miss the earth, you'll miss hitting the earth by 30,000 miles. 1 degree. And use that picture to imagine as you're walking and you start off with the I-dos and you're walking down that aisle. And if you start getting off just a degree, what's going to happen? As you go further and further and further, unless you make corrections. Right? So a natural would be that those corrections are made and we come back together. They're made, we come back together. And that's where communication comes in. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go in. Well, we got a bit of a break, so I want to extend that to you all. And I think we're going to reconvene at 10:15. Freedom.